The morning sun broke across Whitfield Plantation in 1841, casting long shadows over the tobacco fields. But it wasn't the dawn that drew every soul from their cabins that September morning. It was the ladder, standing perfectly upright in the middle of the barn clearing, touching nothing but air itself. Moses Grant, the finest carpenter in 3 counties, had vanished. When Overseer Callahan tried to kick the ladder down in fury, it fell, but by sunrise the next day, there it stood again, balanced on empty space like a ghost's walking stick. The question that haunted Whitfield County wasn't just where Moses had gone, it was how a man could leave behind something that defied every law of nature itself. Before we carry on, would please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. 3 weeks earlier, Moses Grant had been 32 years old, though he looked older. The lines around his eyes came not from age, but from squinting at measurements in dim light, from calculating angles that had to be perfect because Master Whitfield accepted nothing less than perfection. Moses had been born on the plantation, delivered by his mother Esther in the same cabin where she had been born, where her mother had been born before her. The Grant name wasn't theirs by choice. Old Master Whitfield's father had given it to Moses's grandfather when he was purchased at a Charleston auction in 1798, and the name stuck like a brand that went deeper than skin. Moses's hands were his fortune and his curse. They could coax wood into shapes that seemed impossible, could build staircases that curved like water flowing upward, could frame a roof so precise that not a single drop of rain found its way through the shingles even in the worst storms. Master Whitfield had made a small fortune lending Moses out to neighboring plantations, to wealthy families in Savannah who wanted additions to their grand homes, to churches that needed steeples reaching toward heaven. $20 a day Master Whitfield charged, and Moses saw none of it except in the form of slightly better food, a cabin to himself, and the luxury of not working the fields. The barn repair had started on a Monday. The structure was 40 years old, built when Georgia was still finding its footing as a state, and the roof timbers had begun to sag under decades of holding up clay tiles and bearing the weight of coastal humidity. Master Whitfield had been in a state about it for weeks. The barn held his prize horses, 3 thoroughbreds worth more than any 10 enslaved people on the plantation, and he would not risk a collapse. Moses had surveyed the damage, running his hands along the beams, feeling for soft spots where rot had taken hold, testing joints that had loosened over time. On that particular Monday morning, Moses had set up his ladder against the barn's eastern side, where the morning sun would give him the best light for detailed work. The ladder itself was a beautiful thing, something Moses had built 5 years earlier from heart pine that he had selected himself from timber that had been destined for the main house's new gallery. He had asked permission, and Master Whitfield, in a rare moment of generosity or perhaps just distraction, had agreed. The ladder was 16 feet tall, with rungs spaced precisely 13 inches apart, each one fitted into the rails with mortise and tenon joints that would hold for 100 years if treated right. He had climbed up that morning with his tool belt heavy around his waist, carrying a handsaw, a hammer, a draw knife, and various chisels that he had forged himself in the plantation's blacksmith shop during winter evenings. The work was exacting. Each rafter needed to be assessed. Some required sistering with new timber alongside the old, others needed complete replacement. Moses worked methodically, the way his father had taught him before fever took him when Moses was 14. Measure twice, cut once. Respect the wood. Understand its grain, work with it rather than against it. The other enslaved people on Whitfield Plantation regarded Moses with a mixture of respect and distance. His skills set him apart, gave him privileges that created an uncomfortable space between him and those who worked the fields from can't see to can't see. He took his meals alone, worked alone, slept alone in his cabin near the workshop where Master Whitfield stored valuable tools. Some thought him proud. Others understood that loneliness was simply the price of being valuable in a way that made you neither fully slave nor anything approaching free. There was one person who saw Moses differently. Her name was Cecilia, and she worked in the main house as a seamstress. She had come to Whitfield Plantation 3 years earlier, purchased from an estate sale in Augusta after her previous owner died without heirs. Cecilia had learned to sew in a different kind of slavery, in a city household where enslaved people were taught refinements that made them more valuable, where reading was tacitly permitted if it made you better at following pattern books, where the violence was quieter but no less absolute. They had met at the well one evening, both drawing water in the purple twilight that softened the harsh edges of their world. Moses had been immediately struck by the way Cecilia carried herself, with a straightness in her spine that suggested she remembered being something other than property. They had spoken carefully at first, the way enslaved people always spoke when they didn't yet know if the other person could be trusted. But over weeks and months, their evening meetings at the well became something both of them needed, a place where they could speak truths that had no safe place anywhere else. Cecilia had told him about the book she had read before such things were forbidden to her, about a novel called Ivanhoe and another called The Last of the Mohicans. She described characters and plots with such detail that Moses could see them in his mind, could imagine worlds beyond Georgia, beyond tobacco fields and carpenters' workshops. In return, Moses told her about measurements and mathematics, about how everything in the world could be understood through numbers and proportions, about the golden ratio that appeared in seashells and flower petals and the spiral of a perfect staircase. It was Cecilia who first told Moses about the Underground Railroad. She had heard whispers in the main house, fragments of conversation between Master Whitfield and a visiting judge from Savannah. Federal marshals had been cracking down hard that summer of 1841, responding to pressure from Southern politicians who demanded stronger enforcement of fugitive slave laws. But still, people ran, and some impossibly made it north to states where slavery could not follow them. Moses had listened to her words with a feeling like falling, like the moment when you step off a ladder expecting one more rung and find empty air instead. The idea of running had always seemed like a fantasy to him, something that happened in stories but not in the real world, where you could be tracked by dogs, shot in the back for the crime of wanting to own yourself, or caught and returned to a punishment that would make you wish you had never been born. But hearing Cecilia speak about it with such quiet intensity, he felt something shift inside him. Not hope exactly, because hope was dangerous, but something more like a question beginning to form. The work on the barn continued through the week. By Thursday, Moses had replaced 6 rafters completely and reinforced 8 more. The physical labor was demanding but satisfying in the way that good craftsmanship always satisfied him. There was honesty in woodworking. If you cut wrong, the pieces would not fit. If you measured poorly, the structure would fail. Unlike the human world, where things that should not fit were forced together, where structures that should collapse were held up by violence and law. On Friday evening, Moses met Cecilia at the well as usual. She was agitated in a way he had not seen before. In the main house that afternoon, she had overheard Master Whitfield and his wife discussing Moses specifically. The master had received an offer from a plantation owner in Mississippi, a man who had seen Moses's work on a church steeple in Savannah and wanted to purchase him outright. The sum mentioned was staggering. $3,000 more than most enslaved people would earn for their owners in a lifetime of labor. Mrs. Whitfield had been enthusiastic about the sale. They could purchase 3 prime field hands for that price, she argued, and still have enough left over for the new furniture she wanted for the parlor. Master Whitfield had been reluctant but not dismissive. He would consider it, he said. The decision would be made within a month. Moses felt the bottom drop out of his world. Mississippi meant the deep South, meant cotton rather than tobacco, meant a brutality that made even Georgia plantation life look gentle by comparison. It meant being separated from everything and everyone he knew, from his mother's grave in the slave cemetery behind the oak grove, from the tools he had made with his own hands, from Cecilia. That night Moses could not sleep. He lay on his corn-shuck mattress in his cabin, staring at the ceiling beams that he had installed himself when the cabin was built, and for the first time in his life he allowed himself to think seriously about running, not as a fantasy but as a plan. The details cascaded through his mind with the same logical precision he brought to carpentry. He would need money. Though enslaved people were not allowed to own it, he would need directions, constellations to follow, an understanding of which roads led north and which led to slave catchers. He would need luck, an absurd amount of luck, the kind of luck that let one man in 1,000 make it to freedom while the rest died trying. Saturday morning arrived with oppressive humidity that promised thunderstorms by afternoon. Moses climbed his ladder to continue the barn work, but his mind was not on rafters and joints. He thought about Cecilia, about whether he could ask her to run with him, about whether that would be selfishness or love. He thought about the stories she had told him of the Underground Railroad, about how it was not really a railroad but a network of people, some black, some white, who hid runaways and moved them north in the darkness. He thought about Pennsylvania, about a city called Philadelphia where Cecilia said there were thousands of free black people living as citizens, working as craftsmen and shopkeepers, their children going to schools. The ladder stood where it had stood all week, leaning firmly against the barn at exactly the angle Moses had calculated for maximum stability. 67 degrees from horizontal, the perfect compromise between a climb that was too steep and one that was too shallow. The barn swallows that nested in the rafters had grown accustomed to his presence. They swooped around him as he worked, their calls sharp and precise in the thick air. Master Whitfield rode out to inspect the progress that afternoon. He was a tall man, thin in the way wealthy men sometimes get when they worry too much about business. He had inherited the plantation from his father but lacked the old man's talent for agriculture. The profits had been declining for 3 years, which was why the Mississippi offer tempted him despite his reluctance to part with his best craftsmen. Moses climbed down the ladder when he saw the master approaching. Protocol demanded it. An enslaved person did not look down on a white person if it could be avoided, even in the literal sense of elevation. Master Whitfield examined the work, running his hands along the new beams, checking joints with an eye that knew just enough to be dangerous. Moses had learned long ago how to accept inspection, how to stand with eyes slightly lowered but not so much that it looked like deception, how to answer questions precisely without volunteering information that was not requested. The master seemed satisfied. The work was proceeding on schedule. The barn would be secure before the autumn storms came. He did not mention Mississippi, did not mention the $3,000 offer, did not acknowledge that he held Moses's entire future in his casual deliberations. To Master Whitfield, this was simply a business decision, no different from deciding whether to plant tobacco or cotton in the South 40 acres. After the master rode away, Moses climbed back up the ladder. The storm clouds were building on the horizon, great towers of gray and black that promised a deluge. He needed to finish the section he was working on before the rain came, needed to get the new rafter secured so water would not damage the fresh cuts. His hands moved automatically through the work, while his mind continued to race through calculations of a different kind. That evening, the storm broke with spectacular violence. Lightning walked across the sky on brilliant legs, thunder shook the cabin walls, and rain came down so hard it seemed solid. Moses sat in his cabin listening to water drum against the roof he had shingled himself 2 years earlier, and made his decision. He would run. He would leave the ladder leaning against the barn as evidence of a job unfinished, and he would go north. He would find the Underground Railroad somehow, would follow the drinking gourd constellation that Cecilia had told him about, would become one of those people in stories who vanished into the night and reappeared in freedom. The decision brought no peace, only a clarifying terror that sharpened everything around him. He noticed details he had overlooked for years: the particular smell of the lamp oil he used, the sound of rain on different surfaces, the weight of his hammer in his hand. Everything became precious because everything was about to be abandoned. Sunday was the one day when enslaved people on Whitfield Plantation were not required to work, though rest was always conditional, always subject to recall if the master decided some task could not wait. Moses spent the morning in his cabin sorting through his possessions to decide what he could carry. The answer was almost nothing. His tools were too heavy, too distinctive. They would mark him as surely as a brand. He could take one knife, small and easy to conceal. He could take the clothes he wore and nothing more. He met Cecilia at the well in the afternoon. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and almost cool. He told her his decision, watching her face as she processed the information. She did not try to dissuade him, did not point out the 1,000 ways it could go wrong. Instead, she told him everything she had overheard about routes north, about a conductor on the Underground Railroad who sometimes came through Augusta, about how runaways needed to travel by night and hide by day, about which kinds of white people might help and which would turn you in for the reward money. Then Cecilia asked the question Moses had been dreading and hoping for. She asked if she could come with him. Moses felt his heart expand and break simultaneously. He wanted her with him more than he wanted his next breath. But 2 people were easier to spot than 1. 2 people meant slower travel, meant more complicated hiding. And if they were caught, her punishment would be as severe as his. He could not bear the thought of being responsible for that. He tried to explain this to her, tried to make her understand that he was saying no because he cared, not because he did not. Cecilia listened with an expression he could not read, and when he finished, she simply said that she understood. But something in her eyes told him that she did not believe him, that she thought he was choosing his own freedom over their future together. They parted that evening with unfinished words hanging between them, with a distance that felt wider than the few feet separating them. Moses walked back to his cabin feeling like he had already lost something essential, like freedom extracted a price that maybe he should not pay. Monday morning arrived clear and cool, a false hint of autumn that would not last. Moses woke before dawn, which was his habit. He dressed carefully, putting on his best shirt, the one without patches, as if he were going to a job in Savannah instead of to his own escape. He ate the corn cake and molasses that was breakfast, chewing slowly, making it last. Then Moses picked up his tool belt, heavy with the instruments of his trade, and walked out to the barn. The ladder stood where he had left it on Saturday, leaning at its perfect 67-degree angle. He checked the work he had completed, running his hands along the beams one last time. The craftsmanship was good. It would hold for decades. Someone else would finish the job, some other carpenter with skilled hands, and they would see his work and perhaps wonder about the man who had started it. Moses climbed the ladder slowly, counting the rungs from habit. 13 inches apart, 16 feet total. He reached the top and stepped onto the scaffolding he had built along the rafters. From this height, he could see over the barn roof to the fields beyond, rows of tobacco plants heavy with leaves ready for harvest. He could see the main house, white-painted and columned, looking almost noble if you ignored what it represented. He could see the slave cabins, small structures that housed the 70 people who made Whitfield Plantation function. He stood there for a long time, committing it all to memory. This was the only home he had ever known, and he hated it with a pure flame that never went out. But it was still the only home he had ever known. Then Moses did something strange. He carefully descended the ladder, and instead of leaning it back against the barn, he balanced it upright, straight up and down, standing on its base. It was a trick of weight distribution, of understanding where the center of gravity lay. The ladder stood for a moment, wobbling slightly, and then he let it go. It stood. Moses looked at it for a long moment, this impossible thing he had created. A ladder touching nothing but air, defying expectation. Then he turned and walked away from Whitfield Plantation. He walked past the workshop where his tools hung on the walls. He walked past the cabins where people were starting to stir for the day's labor. He walked past the main house where Master Whitfield still slept in his feather bed. He walked past all of it, into the tree line, into the forest that stretched north toward possibility. Behind him, the ladder stood upright in the dawn light, balanced on nothing, waiting for someone to notice. It was Overseer Callahan who discovered Moses's absence. He came to the barn at 7 in the morning to check on the progress and found the ladder standing impossibly in the middle of the clearing. No Moses, no explanation, just the ladder, vertical and steady like a declaration or a joke or a curse. Callahan approached it carefully, as if it might be a trap. He walked around it, examining it from all angles, trying to understand what was holding it up. There was nothing. No wires, no hidden supports, nothing but air. When he finally worked up the courage to touch it, the ladder fell over with a crash, landing in the dirt like any normal ladder would. He reported the situation to Master Whitfield, who came out to see for himself. By then, word had spread through the plantation. Moses was gone. Moses had run, and Moses had left behind something impossible, something that made no sense according to any law of physics or nature. The enslaved people gathered at a distance, watching as Master Whitfield and Callahan examined the fallen ladder, as they organized a search party, as they sent riders to notify the sheriff in town. But the truly strange part came the next morning. When the sun rose on Tuesday, the ladder stood upright again, balanced in exactly the same spot where Moses had left it. Callahan had left it lying on the ground. Someone must have set it up during the night. But who? And more importantly, how? They tried to catch whoever was doing it. Callahan spent Tuesday night watching from a hidden position in the barn loft, staring at the ladder where he had once again knocked it down before sunset. He stayed awake as long as he could, but sometime after midnight, exhaustion took him. When he jerked awake at dawn, the ladder stood upright again. On Wednesday, Master Whitfield had 3 enslaved men watch it in shifts through the night. They reported that nothing happened. The ladder lay on the ground from dusk until just before dawn, and then, without any of them seeing it move, it was standing upright. One of the watchers, a field hand named Joseph, swore he had been staring directly at it when it happened, and he never saw it rise. It was down, and then it was up, with no transition between. By Thursday, people from neighboring plantations were coming to see the miracle or the curse or whatever it was. The ladder that stood by itself. The ladder that Moses Grant had left behind when he vanished. Speculation ran wild. Some said Moses had made a deal with the devil, had traded his soul for freedom and left the ladder as proof of his damning. Some said Moses had been a conjure man, practicing African magic that made the natural world obey impossible commands. Some said Moses had never really been human at all, had been a spirit wearing flesh, and when he left he had shed his physical form and returned to whatever realm had sent him. The enslaved people on Whitfield Plantation had their own theories which they kept to themselves. They said Moses had put something of himself into that ladder, some essential piece of his spirit or his anger or his hope. They said the ladder stood because Moses was still standing somewhere, still moving north toward freedom, and as long as he remained free, the ladder would remain upright. They said it was a message to them all, proof that escape was possible, that the laws of the Master's world could be defied. Master Whitfield tried everything to make it stop. He had the ladder broken apart, the rungs pried from the rails, the pieces burned in a fire. But the next morning the ladder stood whole and upright in the same spot, no marks of fire or violence upon it. He had it thrown in the pond behind the barn. It floated to the surface and drifted to shore, and by morning it stood in its place again. He had it buried 6 feet deep in the woods. By morning it was back, clean of dirt, standing straight. Finally, Master Whitfield gave up and left it alone. The ladder became a feature of Whitfield Plantation, a thing that people came to see, a wonder and a haunting. It stood there through the rest of 1841, through the winter when snow occasionally dusted its rungs, through the spring of 1842 when dogwood blossoms fell around it. Meanwhile, Moses traveled north. He moved by night, navigating by the stars that Cecilia had described to him. He hid in barns and caves during the day, sometimes going 24 hours without food, always afraid that every sound was dogs coming to track him. He crossed into Tennessee after 2 weeks, into Kentucky after 3. He learned to read the landscape for signs of who might be sympathetic, learned which houses had lamps in certain windows that meant safety, which roads to avoid because slave catchers patrolled them. In Kentucky, Moses finally made contact with the Underground Railroad. A Quaker farmer named William Garrett found him sleeping in a hayloft and instead of turning him in, fed him a real meal and sent him to the next station with directions and a letter of introduction. From there, Moses moved through a network of helpers, some white, some black, all risking everything to move strangers toward freedom. He crossed the Ohio River on a September night exactly 2 months after he had left Georgia. The ferryman who took him across asked for no money, wanted no payment except the knowledge that he had helped one more person escape the South. When Moses stepped onto the Ohio shore, onto free soil, he fell to his knees and wept. He wept for the years he had lost, for the family he would never see again, for his mother buried in Georgia clay. He wept for Cecilia, left behind because he had been too afraid to risk her life along with his own. He wept from exhaustion and terror and relief and grief. Moses made his way to Cincinnati, where he found work as a carpenter under a new name. He called himself John Freeman, a name he chose carefully for its meaning. The skills that had made him valuable as a slave made him valuable as a free man. He built houses and barns, churches and schools, each one better than the last. He saved his money with an intensity that surprised the other workmen. He was building towards something, though he would not say what. 2 years after he arrived in Cincinnati, Moses had saved enough to go back south. Not to Georgia, that would be suicide, but to the border regions where the Underground Railroad operated. He met with conductors, people who made regular trips into slave states to guide runaways north. He paid them with his carefully hoarded money, gave them detailed information about Whitfield Plantation, about the layout and the schedules, about where the slave cabins were and where the weapons were kept. He asked them to bring out one person specifically, a seamstress named Cecilia who worked in the main house. He gave them every detail he could remember about her, about what she looked like and how she spoke, about her dreams of freedom that she had whispered to him at the well in the twilight. It took 3 attempts. The first conductor could not locate her, reported that no one by that name was listed in the plantation records. The second conductor found her but was unable to make contact, the security having increased after Moses' escape. The third conductor, a fearless black woman named Harriet who had made the trip south 9 times already, managed to get a message to Cecilia and helped her slip away on a moonless night in March of 1844. Cecilia arrived in Cincinnati on a morning when spring rain was washing the city clean. Moses met her at the safe house where she had spent the night recovering from the journey. When she walked out and saw him standing in the rain, she stopped. They looked at each other across 10 feet of muddy street, across 3 years and 600 miles and all the days of separation. Then Cecilia smiled, and Moses felt something unlock in his chest that he had not realized was still closed. They did not rush to embrace. They walked toward each other slowly, carefully, like people who had learned that nothing in life was certain, that every good thing could be snatched away. When they finally stood face to face, Cecilia spoke first. She told him about the ladder, about how it had stood every morning for weeks after he left, about how people came from all over Georgia to see it, about how Master Whitfield had tried everything to make it stop, about how on the morning that she escaped, she had looked back one last time and seen it standing in the dawn light, impossibly balanced, still waiting. Moses did not know what to say. He had set it upright as a gesture, as a final statement of his craftsmanship and his defiance. He had not known it would remain that way, had not intended to create a legend. But perhaps that was the nature of freedom, of small acts of resistance that echoed louder than anyone planned. Moses and Cecilia married in a free black church in Cincinnati with witnesses who had also escaped slavery, who understood what it meant to choose your own name, your own spouse, your own future. They built a life in that city modest but theirs. Moses's carpentry skills brought steady work. Cecilia's sewing skills did the same. They saved money not for themselves but for the Underground Railroad, contributing what they could to help others make the journey they had made. Years passed. The nation stumbled toward the war that everyone knew was coming but no one wanted to name. In Georgia, the ladder continued to stand at Whitfield Plantation. Though Master Whitfield himself died in 1853, his estate divided among squabbling heirs. The barn fell into disrepair, but the ladder remained upright, weathering storms and seasons without ever falling unless someone deliberately knocked it down. And even then it returned each morning to its impossible balance. During the Civil War, Union forces passed through Whitfield County in 1864. A young officer from Massachusetts tasked with documenting the plantation system for his commanding general wrote about the ladder in his journal. He described it as evidence of Negro superstition, unable to conceive that it might be evidence of something else entirely, something that could not be easily categorized or dismissed. When the war ended and emancipation came, the freed people of Whitfield Plantation held their first meeting as free citizens in the clearing where the ladder stood. They spoke about their futures, about whether to stay or leave, about how to navigate a world that had declared them human but had not yet determined what that meant in practice. The ladder stood among them like a witness, like a monument to the man who had escaped before the law caught up with reality. In Cincinnati, Moses learned about the ladder's persistence through letters from people who had followed him north, from runaways who passed through the Underground Railroad stations and spoke of legends from Georgia. He listened to these stories with wonder and discomfort. He had not meant to become a story, had only meant to become free. By 1870, Moses and Cecilia had 3 children, all born free, all carrying the surname Freeman that Moses had chosen. The children went to schools built by the freed black community, learned to read and write and calculate, learned trades that would let them make their own ways in the world. Moses taught his oldest son carpentry, passing on the skills that had saved his life and buying him freedom, but teaching them differently, teaching them as gift rather than as necessity, as craft rather than as survival. Moses never went back to Georgia. The thought of returning to that place, even as a free man, filled him with a dread that had no logic but would not be dismissed. He had left something of himself there in the form of that ladder, and he thought perhaps that was enough. Let it stand as proof that he had existed, that he had resisted, that he had escaped. But Cecilia went back in 1875, traveling with their oldest daughter, Rebecca, who was studying to be a teacher. They went as free women, carrying papers that proved their status, traveling openly in train cars rather than hiding in cargo holds. Cecilia wanted to see the place she had escaped, wanted to confirm that it no longer had power over her. Whitfield Plantation was diminished by then, the grand house subdivided into tenements, the fields divided among sharecroppers who worked the same land but could now theoretically leave if they chose. The barn where Moses had worked still stood, though barely. The roof he had started to repair was complete now, finished by some other carpenter whose name no one remembered. And the ladder stood, upright, balanced on nothing, exactly as it had stood for 34 years. Cecilia walked up to it carefully, reached out to touch the wood that Moses's hands had shaped. It was weathered gray now, the pine heartwood showing through in places where the surface had worn away. But it was solid, structurally sound, defying decay as thoroughly as it defied gravity. Cecilia's daughter, Rebecca, 19 years old and educated and free, asked her mother why the ladder stood. What made it possible? Cecilia thought about the question for a long time before answering. She finally said that she thought it stood because Moses had poured something into it, some essence of his will and his anger and his hope. She said it stood because somewhere in the world Moses still stood, still lived as a free man with a free family. She said it stood as evidence that the impossible could become possible if you were willing to risk everything. But then Cecilia added something else. She said maybe the ladder stood simply because everyone believed it would, because the story had taken on a life of its own, had become more powerful than physics or logic. Because people needed to believe that something in the world could defy the laws that had trapped them for so long. Rebecca, practical and educated, suggested they test it. She walked up to the ladder and pushed it hard. It fell, crashing to the ground with a sound that seemed too loud for the moment. Mother and daughter stood looking at the fallen ladder for a long time. Then they turned and walked away, leaving it lying in the Georgia dirt. The next morning, according to people who lived nearby, the ladder stood upright again. It would continue to stand for another 20 years, through rain and drought, through the slow reconstruction of the South and the faster betrayal of promises made to freed people. It stood until the barn finally collapsed in a storm in 1895, timbers crashing down around it but never touching it. After the barn fell, someone moved the ladder to the small church that the freed black community had built on the edge of what used to be Whitfield Plantation. They set it up inside the church, upright in the corner, and there it finally stopped its morning resurrections. Perhaps because it had found a home, or perhaps because Moses Grant died that same year in Cincinnati, passing peacefully in his sleep at the age of 86. Surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew his story but not his bondage. The ladder remained in that church for decades, becoming a relic of a time that people wanted to remember and forget in equal measure. People would touch it for luck, for courage, for connection to a man who had escaped when escape seemed impossible. Preachers used it in sermons as a metaphor for faith, for perseverance, for the idea that God could make possible what human law declared impossible. But the ladder's meaning shifted over generations. To Moses's children, it represented their father's courage and the sacrifice of separation that bought their freedom. To their children, it represented the old ways, the supernatural beliefs that educated black people were supposed to outgrow. By the middle of the 20th century, it was simply an old ladder in a country church, interesting mainly for its age and craftsmanship. The church burned in 1968 during a summer of racial violence that swept through the South like a delayed echo of the Civil War. The ladder should have burned with it. Wood and fire are old enemies, and fire usually wins. But when the ashes cooled, the ladder was found lying intact among the ruins, scorched but not consumed, its joints still sound, its structure still true. A grandson of Moses, a man named David Freeman who taught history at a black college in Atlanta, came to collect the ladder from the ruins. He took it to the college and placed it in a small museum of African American history that the school maintained. There it stood, not upright now, but leaning safely against a wall, labeled with a placard that told the story of Moses Grant, carpenter and runaway, and the ladder that had defied physics and time. David Freeman had grown up hearing stories about his grandfather, about the ladder, about impossible escapes and miraculous defiance. As a historian, he wanted to believe the stories but felt compelled to question them. He examined the ladder carefully, looking for tricks, for hidden mechanisms that might explain its behavior. He found none. It was simply a very well-made ladder, crafted by someone who understood wood and mathematics, who had built something that would last. But lasting and standing upright without support were different things. David researched contemporary accounts, reading old newspapers, checking courthouse records, interviewing elderly people who remembered grandparents who had seen the ladder stand. The consistency of the accounts disturbed him. Too many people across too many years reported the same impossible thing. David developed a theory that he shared with his students but never published. He suggested that the ladder had stood because Moses had built it to stand, had calculated the weight distribution and the center of gravity so precisely that it could balance on its base, at least for a few moments. And in those few moments, before it inevitably fell, anyone watching would see it standing. The overnight resurrections, he theorized, were the work of believers, of people who wanted the miracle to be true and so made it true by setting the ladder up each night. It was a rational explanation, the kind a historian and educator had to offer. But David never quite believed it himself. He had touched the ladder, had felt the wood beneath his hands, and had sensed something in it that resisted easy explanation. Not magic exactly, but something more like intention, like we'll translate it into pine and preserved across generations. The ladder remained in the college museum until 2008, when the building was renovated and the museum relocated. During the move, the ladder was examined by a team of conservators who documented its construction and condition. They marveled at the craftsmanship, at joints that had held for over 160 years, at wood that should have rotted but had somehow remained sound. They recommended climate-controlled storage, professional preservation techniques, the kind of care normally reserved for artifacts from ancient civilizations. But the director of the college museum, a woman named Angela Harris, who had descended from people enslaved on a plantation adjacent to Whitfield, made a different decision. She had the ladder installed in the museum's main gallery, standing upright, balanced on its base, held by nothing but its own perfect construction. She added a sign that invited visitors to try to replicate the balance, to see if they could make an ordinary ladder stand the way this one had stood. No one ever could. Ladders would wobble and fall, would require support or leaning. But Moses's ladder stood, at least while people watched, at least long enough for them to see that it was possible. And if it sometimes fell during the night, if security cameras sometimes caught it lying on the floor in the hours after the museum closed, well, by morning it always stood again. The museum staff never discussed it, never admitted that they took turns setting it upright before the doors opened, never acknowledged that they were continuing a tradition that stretched back to 1841. The story of Moses Grant and his ladder became part of the museum's regular tours, told to school children and historians, to tourists and descendants. The story changed in the telling, as stories always do. Some versions emphasized the supernatural elements, the miracle of the standing ladder. Others focused on Moses' craftsmanship, his intelligence, his practical skill. Some told it as a love story, about a man who escaped and then risked everything to bring his beloved to freedom. Others told it as a political story about resistance and the fight against slavery. All the versions contained truth, even when they contradicted each other. Because Moses Grant had been all those things, craftsman and lover, practical man, and perhaps something more. Someone who had left behind an artifact that refused to be forgotten or easily explained. In the end, the ladder's meaning was less about physics and more about memory. It stood as a reminder that enslaved people were not passive victims but active resistors, people who found ways to assert their humanity in a system designed to deny it. It stood as proof that escape was possible, even when the odds were overwhelming. It stood as a symbol of craftsmanship, of the way skill and knowledge could buy a kind of freedom even within bondage. It stood as a love story, evidence that people found ways to care for each other even in the worst circumstances. It stood as a mystery, something that defied easy explanation and therefore invited wonder. Moses Grant lived his last years in Cincinnati, working until his hands became too stiff for fine carpentry, then teaching and advising younger craftsmen. He and Cecilia grew old together in a house he had built himself, solid and square and true, with no unnecessary ornamentation but perfect in its proportions. Their children and grandchildren visited often, bringing the noise and chaos of large family gatherings, filling the house with life. Moses rarely spoke about Georgia, about his years in bondage, about the ladder. When pressed by grandchildren who wanted to hear stories, he would tell them about measurements and angles, about the properties of different woods, about how a good craftsman respected his materials and worked with them rather than against them. The lessons were about carpentry, but they were also about life, about understanding your circumstances and finding ways to work within them while preserving something essential in yourself. Only once, near the end of his life, did Moses speak directly about the ladder. His oldest grandson, Rebecca's son, was preparing to go south to help with a building project at a school for freed black children. The young man who bore Moses' gift for carpentry asked his grandfather if the stories about the ladder were true. Moses thought for a long time before answering. Then he said that he had built the ladder to stand, had calculated everything precisely, had done his best work on it because it was for himself. He said that on the morning he left, he had balanced it upright as a gesture, as a way of saying that he refused to finish the master's barn, that he was taking his skills and his labor away from a system that had stolen both. He said he did not know why the ladder continued to stand after that. Perhaps it had been believers who set it upright each night. Perhaps there was something in the construction he had not fully understood. Perhaps the whole thing was exaggerated in the retelling. He said it did not matter. What mattered was that he had made his escape, had built a free life, had brought Cecilia out of bondage, had raised free children who were raising free children of their own. The ladder, Moses said, was just a ladder. But it was also everything because it represented the moment when he had chosen himself, when he had decided that his life belonged to him regardless of what the law said, when he had walked away from the only home he had known toward a future that was terrifying and uncertain and his own. Moses Grant died 3 days after that conversation, passing quietly in the night, his hand held by Cecilia, who had sat with him through the evening, talking about nothing and everything, remembering their life together. He was buried in a cemetery in Cincinnati, in a plot he had purchased himself, with a headstone that read, "John Freeman, devoted husband and father, Master Carpenter." The name he had been born with was not on the stone because that name had belonged to Master Whitfield, and Moses had claimed a different identity when he claimed his freedom. Back in Georgia, in the museum where it had found its final home, the ladder continued to stand. Generations of conservators and curators watched over it, documenting its condition, noting the slow changes that time brought to even the best-preserved artifacts. The wood aged, the color deepened, small cracks appeared in the rails. But the ladder stood. It stood as memory, as mystery, as a question that each generation had to answer for themselves. Did it stand because Moses Grant had built it to stand? Because believers needed it to stand? Because stories have power that transcends physics? Or simply because it was a very good ladder built by a master craftsman who had poured everything he knew into its construction? The answer, like so many answers about slavery and freedom, about the past and its continuing presence, depended on who was asking and what they needed to believe. The ladder accepted all interpretations, standing silent and vertical, balanced between earth and sky, between past and present, between bondage and freedom. It stood the way Moses Grant had stood when he walked away from Whitfield Plantation, upright and defiant, touching nothing but claiming everything. Impossible but absolutely real. And on certain mornings, when the light came through the museum windows at just the right angle, visitors swore they could see Moses himself standing beside his creation, his hands scarred from decades of work, his eyes watching to see if the ladder held, if the joints remained true, if his legacy still stood after all the years that had passed. Then the light would shift and he would be gone, if he had ever been there at all, leaving only the ladder standing in the silence, proving that good work endures, that freedom is possible, that sometimes the impossible becomes real if you build it carefully enough and believe in it completely. The ladder stood because Moses had made it to stand. The ladder stood because people needed it to stand. The ladder stood because stories have power. The ladder stood because it was a very good ladder. All of these things were true and none of them were complete, and that was perhaps the point, that some things cannot be fully explained or understood, only witnessed and remembered and passed on to the next generation who would see in it what they needed to see, what their moment required them to understand. And so the ladder stands still in a museum in Atlanta, balanced on its base, defying gravity or proving mathematics depending on your perspective. Children press their faces close to the protective barrier, trying to see the trick, trying to understand how it works. Historians study it, document it, theorize about it. Descendants of enslaved people stand before it in silence, seeing in its vertical defiance an echo of their ancestors' resistance. And sometimes, late at night when the museum is closed and the security guards make their rounds, they find the ladder lying on the floor, fallen at last. But they pick it up, set it carefully on its base, adjust it until it balances, and by morning it stands again, ready for another day of telling its impossible, necessary story. The years between Moses' escape and his death contained lifetimes' worth of experience compressed into 5 decades of freedom. In Cincinnati, Moses had joined a community of formerly enslaved people who were building something unprecedented in American history. A black middle class forged not through inheritance but through skill and determination and mutual support. The city sat on the border between slavery and freedom, which made it both dangerous and essential. Slave catchers prowled the streets looking for runaways, while abolitionists operated safe houses and planned rescue missions. Moses existed in this tension, always aware that his freedom was conditional, that the Fugitive Slave Act meant he could be captured and returned south at any moment until the war finally came and changed everything. During those early years in Cincinnati, Moses had worked alongside other craftsmen, some freeborn, some escaped like himself. There was a cabinet maker named Benjamin Clark who had purchased his own freedom after 20 years of saving every penny his master allowed him to keep. There was a blacksmith named Isaac Washington who had been freed in his owner's will, and had walked from Virginia to Ohio carrying his tools on his back. These men formed a guild of sorts, not official because black craftsmen were excluded from white trade unions, but real nonetheless. They shared work, taught each other techniques, lent each other tools and money when times were hard. Moses learned from them that freedom was not a destination but a practice, something you had to do every day. It meant negotiating with white customers who expected to pay black craftsmen less than white ones for the same work. It meant dealing with city officials who tried to enforce black codes that restricted where free black people could live and work. It meant saving money not just for yourself but for the community, contributing to funds that helped new runaways get established, that paid lawyers to fight kidnapping cases, that supported the Underground Railroad's continued operations. The work itself became different in freedom. When Moses had been enslaved, his carpentry had belonged to Master Whitfield. Every table he built, every house he framed, every staircase he constructed had been a testament to his owner's wealth and taste. Moses's skill had reflected on Whitfield, had made the master look prosperous and discerning. Now in freedom, Moses's work belonged to himself. When someone admired a porch he had built or a door he had hung, they were admiring Moses Grant, or rather John Freeman as he was known. The pride that came with that was almost painful in its intensity, like blood returning to a limb that had gone numb. Moses had taken particular satisfaction in building homes for other formerly enslaved people. He charged them less than he charged white customers, sometimes working for just the cost of materials because he understood what it meant to have a home that was truly yours, that no master could sell out from under you, that you could pass on to your children. He built small houses, nothing grand, but solid and well constructed with good foundations that would last generations. Each one was a quiet declaration that black people were here to stay, that they were building permanence in a world that had tried to make them temporary. The money Moses had spent to bring Cecilia north had taken him 2 years to save. During that time, he had worked obsessively, taking every job offered, working from dawn until after dark, eating little, spending nothing on himself. The other craftsmen had worried about him, had tried to get him to slow down, to live a little. But Moses had been driven by a guilt that had no logic but would not be dismissed. He had left Cecilia behind. Every day she remained enslaved was a day he had chosen his freedom over hers. The fact that taking her with him might have doomed them both did not ease the guilt. It simply made him work harder, save faster, push himself until exhaustion was a constant companion. When Cecilia had finally arrived in Cincinnati, when Moses had seen her walking toward him through the spring rain, the guilt had not disappeared but had transformed into something else. Relief, yes, but also a fierce determination that they would build a life worth the risk she had taken to get there. The wedding had been simple, held in a church that met in a warehouse because the congregation could not yet afford a proper building. The preacher was a man named Reverend Johnson who had escaped from Kentucky and taught himself to read using a Bible he had stolen from his master's library. The witnesses were people who understood that marriage for formerly enslaved people meant something specific, meant claiming the right to family that slavery had denied, meant declaring that your love was your own and not subject to a master's permission or a buyer's whim. Moses and Cecilia's first home had been a single room above a dry goods store, 10 feet by 12 feet, with a window that looked out on an alley and a small stove that heated the space inadequately in winter. But it was theirs. They had a lock on the door that only they had the key to. They could come and go as they pleased. They could lie together at night without fear that one of them would be sold away in the morning. These simple freedoms were miracles that never stopped feeling miraculous. Cecilia had found work quickly, her sewing skills in high demand among Cincinnati's growing black community. She made dresses for women who were experiencing for the first time the ability to choose their own clothing, to wear colors that pleased them rather than the rough homespun that slaveholders provided. She made suits for men who were going to court to fight for their rights, to church to worship in their own way, to businesses they were trying to establish. Each garment was made with extraordinary care because Cecilia understood that clothing was not just fabric but a statement of dignity, a way of claiming space in the world. Their first child, a daughter they named Sarah, had been born in 1846. Moses had built a cradle for her, spending weeks on the project, carving details into the headboard that showed symbols he half remembered from his mother. Patterns that might have been African or might have been his own invention. The night Sarah was born, Moses had sat in their small room holding his daughter, studying her face, and had wept with a complexity of emotions he could not name. Joy at her existence, terror at the responsibility of keeping her safe, rage at the children he might have had who would have been born into slavery. Grief for his mother who would never know her granddaughter. As Sarah and later Rebecca and then young Moses grew, their father had been determined that they would know their history but not be defined by it. He told them stories about Georgia, about the plantation, about the work he had done and the escape he had made. But he also taught them carpentry and mathematics, read to them from books that Cecilia bought or borrowed, encouraged them to ask questions about everything. He wanted them to understand where they came from without being trapped by it, to know the weight of history without being crushed beneath it. The children grew up in a Cincinnati that was changing rapidly. The Compromise of 1850 had brought the Fugitive Slave Act, which made the city more dangerous for runaways. Federal marshals could demand that local citizens help capture escaped slaves, could override local laws that protected black people. Moses and Cecilia had lived in constant low-grade fear during those years, always aware that someone might recognize Moses from a wanted poster, might claim the reward that Master Whitfield had offered for his return. But the community had protected him. When slave catchers came through the neighborhood asking questions, people claimed ignorance, gave false directions, warned the targets to hide. The network of safety was imperfect and constantly under threat, but it held more often than it broke. Moses had helped maintain that network, contributing money and labor to the cause of protecting runaways and resisting the law that said freedom could be revoked by a master's claim. During the 1850s, Moses had also become involved in the nascent movement for black civil rights. Cincinnati had a thriving black intellectual community, people who published newspapers, organized debating societies, held conventions to discuss strategy and philosophy. Moses had attended meetings where Frederick Douglass spoke, where other formerly enslaved people shared their stories and argued about the best path forward. Should black people focus on proving their worthiness to white America, or should they demand rights that needed no justification? Should they work within the system or challenge it from outside? Should they stay in America or emigrate to Africa or Haiti or Canada? Moses had mostly listened during these debates, uncomfortable with public speaking, aware that his lack of formal education made his thoughts feel inadequate. But he had opinions nonetheless. He believed that freedom was not something you proved yourself worthy of, but something inherent, something that existed regardless of whether others acknowledged it. He believed that the work itself mattered, that building good houses and raising good children and supporting your community was a form of activism, even if it was not as visible as giving speeches or writing essays. One night in 1857, at a meeting in the basement of a black church, Moses had finally spoken up. The debate had been about whether black people should learn trades or focus on classical education. One faction argued that trades kept black people in subordinate positions, doing manual labor while white people monopolized intellectual work. The other faction argued that trades provided economic independence, that a black carpenter or blacksmith could support a family and contribute to community wealth in ways that philosophy and Latin could not. Moses had stood up, his hands shaking slightly, and talked about carpentry. He talked about how understanding geometry and physics was essential to good building, how reading and mathematics were embedded in the work itself. He talked about how his skills had saved his life, had bought him a measure of autonomy even in slavery, had provided for his family and freedom. He talked about how building homes for black families was as important as any other kind of freedom work, because those homes were the foundation on which everything else rested. The speech had not changed anyone's mind. Debates like that never did. But afterward, several people had come up to Moses and thanked him, had said they had needed to hear someone articulate what they had been feeling but could not express. That moment had marked a shift for Moses, had helped him understand that his experience and perspective had value beyond the immediate practical benefits of his skills. As the 1850s wore on and the nation moved toward war, Moses had watched with a mixture of hope and dread. He hoped that the conflict would end slavery, would make impossible the system that had stolen his youth and his family. But he dreaded the violence he knew was coming, dreaded the cost in lives that freedom would demand. When the war finally came in 1861, Moses had been too old to fight, 42 years old with a family depending on him. But his son, young Moses, 16 and burning with righteous anger, had enlisted in one of the black regiments that formed after the Emancipation Proclamation. Young Moses had fought in battles whose names became legend, had marched through Georgia burning the symbols of Confederate power, had survived the war but returned changed in ways his father recognized but could not heal. The young man had seen things in battle that broke something in him, had killed men in the name of freedom, had watched friends die in mud and blood. When he came home to Cincinnati in 1865, he was quiet in a way that was different from his father's quiet, haunted by memories that intruded at unexpected moments. The family had tried to help him readjust to civilian life. Moses had brought his son into the carpentry business, hoping that the work would provide structure and purpose. For a while it seemed to help. Young Moses threw himself into building, into the physical exhaustion that kept the memories at bay during the day and let him sleep at night. But the war stayed with him, coloring everything, making it hard for him to believe in the future they were supposedly building. Meanwhile, news kept coming from the South about what was happening to the freed people. The promises of 40 acres and a mule mostly evaporated. The brief period of Reconstruction when black men voted and held office gave way to the rise of the Klan and the imposition of new systems of control. Sharecropping replaced slavery but kept black people tied to the land and to debt. The black codes became Jim Crow laws. The war had ended slavery but had not created justice, and Moses watched with bitter recognition as the nation found new ways to deny black people the full fruits of their freedom. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, Moses had continued building. He and his son worked together on projects large and small, framing houses and barns, installing windows and doors, building furniture for people who could afford it. The work was good and people knew it. White customers sometimes expressed surprise that a black carpenter could do such fine work, as if skill was racially determined. Moses had learned to accept the backhanded compliments without comment, had learned that arguing with prejudice was like arguing with weather, pointless and exhausting. In 1872, Moses had been offered a commission that forced him to confront his past in a direct way. A white businessman in Cincinnati, a man named Harrison, who claimed to be an abolitionist and who had made money selling supplies to the Union Army, wanted to build a new warehouse. He specifically requested Moses for the job, having heard about his reputation for quality work. The pay was generous enough that Moses could not easily refuse, But Harrison wanted the warehouse built in a particular style, with exposed beam construction that Harrison said reminded him of tobacco barns he had seen in Georgia. Moses had stood in Harrison's office, looking at the drawings, feeling something twist in his stomach. Tobacco barns, the very structures that had housed the crop that slavery had been built to harvest. Harrison saw them as aesthetically interesting, as rustic and authentic. Moses saw them as monuments to suffering, as spaces where he had worked in heat and cold, where he had built wealth for a man who owned him. The idea of reproducing that architecture, of using his skills to create something that looked like the buildings of his bondage, felt wrong in a way he struggled to articulate. But Moses had taken the job because his family needed the money, because turning down work was a luxury he could not afford, because he told himself that a warehouse in Cincinnati was not the same as a barn in Georgia, no matter what style it was built in. He completed the project on time and to specification, and Harrison was delighted, paid promptly, and recommended Moses to other wealthy clients. But something in Moses had shifted during that work. He had felt like he was betraying something, though he could not say exactly what or to whom. That same year, Moses had received a letter that changed his understanding of his own history. It came from Georgia, from a woman named Clara, who identified herself as the daughter of Joseph, one of the field hands on Whitfield Plantation. She had learned to write during Reconstruction, taught by a northern teacher who had come south to educate the freed people. Clara wrote that she had heard stories about Moses Grant all her life, about the carpenter who had escaped and left the ladder standing. She wrote that the ladder had become a source of pride for the freed people of Whitfield County, proof that resistance was possible, that enslaved people had been more than victims. But Clara also wrote something that Moses had never known. She wrote that his escape had consequences for the people left behind. Master Whitfield, enraged by the loss of his valuable carpenter and humiliated by the mysterious ladder, had increased the punishments for small infractions, had sold 3 people to the Deep South as examples, had created an atmosphere of terror meant to prevent anyone else from attempting escape. Clara did not write this to blame Moses. She was careful to say that. The blame belonged to Whitfield, belonged to the system of slavery itself. But she thought Moses should know that his freedom had costs that others had paid. Moses had read the letter sitting alone in his workshop, and had felt something inside him crack open. He had known, abstractly, that his escape might bring punishment to those left behind, but he had not let himself think about it in detail, had protected himself from that knowledge because bearing it seemed impossible. Now here it was, laid out in careful handwriting by a woman who had been a child when he escaped, but who carried the memories of what came after. He had written back to Clara, a letter that took him weeks to compose. He wrote about his life in Cincinnati, about his family, about the work he did and the community he was part of. He wrote about the guilt he carried and the knowledge that guilt changed nothing, that he could not unescape, could not go back and choose differently. He wrote about how freedom and responsibility were tangled together in ways that never got easier to navigate. He sent money with the letter, not much but what he could spare to help Clara and her family. That correspondence had continued for years. Clara wrote about life in Georgia after emancipation, about the struggles and small victories of building free lives in the same places where they had been enslaved. Moses wrote about Cincinnati, about the northern version of freedom that came with its own limitations and dangers. They never met in person. Moses could not bring himself to return south, and Clara could not afford to travel north. But the letters created a connection across distance, a way of understanding that history was not past but ongoing, that decisions made in 1841 still echoed decades later. In his 70s, Moses had slowed down physically, but his mind remained sharp. He spent less time doing carpentry himself and more time teaching, taking on apprentices who wanted to learn the trade. He was patient with them in ways he might not have been when younger, understanding that skill came slowly, that mistakes were part of learning. He taught them not just how to measure and cut and join, but why, explaining the mathematics and physics that made structures stable, helping them understand the principles rather than just memorizing techniques. One of his apprentices was a young man named Daniel, whose parents had been enslaved in Maryland. Daniel was quick and clever, with good hands and a mind that grasped spatial relationships intuitively. Moses saw in him echoes of his own younger self and poured into Daniel's training everything he knew. He taught him about wood selection, about how to read grain and anticipate how different species would respond to humidity and temperature. He taught him about joinery, about which techniques were strong and which were merely decorative. He taught him about dealing with customers, about how to estimate costs, how to negotiate prices, how to stand firm on quality even when clients wanted shortcuts. Daniel asked Moses once about the ladder, about whether the stories were true. They were working together on a complicated roof frame, and Daniel had been struggling with getting the angles right. Moses had shown him how to use a framing square, how to lay out the cuts precisely. And Daniel had suddenly asked, "Did you really leave a ladder standing by itself?" Moses had not answered immediately. He focused on the work, checking Daniel's measurements, making small corrections. Then he said that he had built a good ladder, had balanced it carefully on the morning he left, had walked away while it stood. What happened after that, he said, was between the ladder and God and the people who needed to believe in something impossible. He said that sometimes the truth of a story was less important than what the story did, how it made people feel, what it inspired them to do. Daniel had seemed satisfied with that answer, or at least had understood that it was the only answer Moses would give. They had gone back to work, cutting rafters and testing angles, building something that would shelter people from storms, that would last longer than either of them would live. When Cecilia died in 1893, Moses felt like half of himself had been amputated. They had been together for 49 years, had built a life that seemed impossible when they first met at the well on Whitfield Plantation. She died quietly in her sleep, which was a mercy, but Moses would have traded mercy for more time. He would have traded anything for more time. The funeral was large, attended by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, by people Cecilia had sewn for and taught and helped, by members of the church they had attended for decades, by friends and neighbors who understood that they were burying not just a woman but a whole generation of struggle and survival. Moses sat through it in silence, accepting condolences he barely heard, his mind full of memories that crowded out the present. After Cecilia's death, Moses had withdrawn into his workshop. He built things compulsively, furniture and boxes and small, intricate objects that served no purpose except to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. His children worried about him, tried to get him to eat properly, to rest, to engage with the world. But Moses was somewhere else, somewhere in the past, reliving conversations with Cecilia, remembering the sound of her laugh, the way her hands moved when she sewed, the feeling of waking up next to her for 49 years. It was his grandson, Rebecca's son, who bore Moses's name, who finally pulled him back. Young Moses Freeman came to the workshop one day and said he needed help building a house, needed the old man's expertise and strength. It was not entirely true. Young Moses was an accomplished builder himself, but he understood that his grandfather needed to be needed a purpose beyond grief. They worked together on that house through the winter of 1893 and into the spring of 1894. Moses moved slowly now, his joints stiff with age, his hands not as steady as they once were. But his knowledge was undiminished, And young Moses learned things from his grandfather that he had not known there was to learn. They talked while they worked, about family and history, about slavery and freedom, about what it meant to build something that would last. During one of those conversations, Moses told his grandson about the morning he left the plantation, about balancing the ladder and walking away. He told him that he had spent 53 years wondering if he had made the right choice, if the costs of his freedom had been worth paying. He said he still did not know the answer, that maybe there was no answer, that maybe you just made choices and lived with them and hoped that the balance came out right in the end. Young Moses had listened without interrupting, and when his grandfather finished, he said something that the old man had not expected. He said that by escaping, by bringing Cecilia north, by building a free family, his grandfather had created the conditions for young Moses's existence. Every one of the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren owed their freedom to that decision made in 1841. The cost had been real, but so was the life that came from it. Moses died 3 days after that conversation, as if he had been waiting for permission to let go. He passed quietly, his hand held by a grandson who carried his name and his skills and his determination to build things that would last. The funeral was even larger than Cecilia's had been because Moses had lived longer and touched more lives. People came from all over Cincinnati, black craftsmen and white customers, apprentices and colleagues, family members numbering in the dozens. They buried him next to Cecilia in the cemetery he had chosen, under a stone that bore the name John Freeman and the dates of a life lived mostly in freedom. No one mentioned Moses Grant, the name given to him by a master who had owned his body but never his soul. That name existed now only in stories, in museum plaques, in the history that his descendants would carry forward.